Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. Her favourite hotel in the world is the Pathumwan Princess in Bangkok, Leanne Hughes.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are tuning into this podcast. I've just jumped off the line to today's guest, Paul Hellman from Express Potential, and I'm feeling very invigorated and excited. We're both driven by the same thing. We believe that life is too short for people to waste our times in meetings or workshops by delivering presentations poorly. We spoke about a variety of different ways that you can avoid this. Avoid wasting people's time and start presenting with impact and build a strong presence. We spoke about the importance of getting yourself in the mood to present, strategies to show your audience that you're confident, even though you may be not feeling as confident, and how to use variety in your delivery, in fact, in ways that I had never even considered. It's all gold. And you can hear that Paul has dedicated a lot of his time to honing his communication skills. He's very easy to listen to. Before we move to the interview, a couple of things are happening in First Time Facilitator land. Show notes for this episode can be found at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 12. And while you're on the website, you can also sign up to the First Time Facilitator Flipchart mailing list, which is a monthly email where I send out useful information, apps, tools, and other cool resources to really up your facilitation game. If you want to know how I get in the mood to facilitate a workshop, follow or contribute to my Spotify playlist. Just log into the app and search for the words First Time Facilitator. Now, onto the show. Our guest today consults and speaks internationally about effective behaviour at work and has worked with thousands of executives, managers and employees in leading companies. He has a master's in management and several degrees in psychology and has taught graduate courses in organisational psychology. Companies hire him to get faster results from presentations, meetings and emails. He's written columns for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, as well as television commentaries for CNN's Financial Network. His latest book is You've Got 8 Seconds, Communication Secrets for a Distracted World. Welcome to the show, Paul Hellman.
Well, wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. Wow, you've got a lot of career history there, quite a few degrees. You also teach and have worked a bit in the media. Your mission is to get heard and get results with fast, focused communication. What moments in your career led you to this?
Well, actually, throughout my career, I've done any number of different things, but I've always been very interested in leadership development and professional development. And so what that means is I'm in rooms with executives and managers and so forth. And of course, if you're in a room like that in the last while, you can't help noticing how rare it is for people to really connect. And what I mean by connect is you're speaking and somebody else is really listening and your message is getting through. And I think that's becoming more and more of a rarity. And what I see as very commonplace is what I describe as airplane mode. So airplane mode is when you get on an airplane and you sit in your seat and you buckle up, and then the flight attendants have to get up and they have to review the safety information, which it turns out is really critical, but to which we, the passengers, could care less. And so frequently at meetings, someone will be talking, but that doesn't mean that anybody else is actually paying attention. And so that's the problem that I am committed to trying to help people solve.
That's a really great example, and we use that analogy a lot of the airplane. We, in my current role, work in a really high-risk industry where at the beginning of every day there's some safety messages that are given out. But like the safety briefing on an airplane, it becomes a bit like Groundhog Day, and you do look around the room and some people have switched off to what is an important message. Do you think the accountability is on the speaker or the listener to get the attention?
When I'm working with people, I I tell the people that I work with, the accountability is completely on you. So if you're speaking, it's your responsibility to figure out how to crack the code. And what I mean by that is, how do you make sure that your message gets heard and that it gets remembered and that it gets the results that you're intending? So the fact that I think we can agree that attention spans keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter, that is just one of many constraints. So we all live in that world. That's the given.
It is a given. And this is, I guess, the main premise of your book, 8 Seconds, Communication Secrets for a Distracted World. You speak about 3 things that we should focus on, some critical skills as the presenter. Could you share that with our listeners?
Well, what I've discovered, Leanne, is that there are 3 major strategies for how you can break through and make sure that your message, again, is heard and remembered and that it leads to the result that you're hoping for. And the 3 strategies, very simply, are number 1, focus, number 2, variety, and number 3, presence. And if you'd like, we can certainly drill down on all 3. And if you'd like, I can say a quick sentence on each one now.
Oh, yeah, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
So focus, the first strategy, focus is partially about how can you say it concisely. But focus is also about how can you craft a message which is going to have audience interest. So that's what goes. It's really about message design. Variety is about being slightly different. And the word slightly is really important because slightly different is enough, and we don't want people to do things that are outrageously different, which would certainly gather attention, but might be career risky. So what can you do that is slightly different? And we can talk later about some examples. Mm-hmm. And then presence is the mysterious one, because it turns out that there are people that you and I just listen to, and we're not even sure why. It's not really about their title. They just seem to have some presence that draws us. And so in the book, one of the things that I do in the book is to try to take presence and demystify it. And I do that by looking at, here are 10 things. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but here are 10 things that I believe, again, based on about 30 years of consulting experience, contribute to somebody being perceived, because it really is about being perceived, as having this quality called presence. So focus, variety, presence. I can really explain, if I'm in a room and somebody is either getting listened to or the opposite, I can almost always explain it by some combination of one or more of those 3 factors.
Yeah. And if they're really not performing well at all, you think, well, they haven't ticked any of those boxes, really.
They haven't checked any of the boxes. So their message is long and rambling. It's not focused. Their message makes them sound like everybody else. So when you used the phrase earlier, Groundhog Day, that's spot on. And consciously or unconsciously, they're doing things that subtract from their power or their presence.
That's really powerful. So let's talk about the first one, crafting a message. And in the world of facilitation, a lot of the time we don't expect training and facilitation are quite different. Training is giving instructions and being quite prescriptive, whereas facilitation is engaging with your audience and ensuring that their learning experiences are shared with the room, and you're sort of controlling the direction of the conversation. So how do you use focus then to prepare as a facilitator for running, say, a group workshop?
Yeah, and I do actually all the time both those things, and sometimes in the same event. So if I'm doing a workshop, let's say that's 3 hours or a full day, it's certainly not me talking for that length of time. So I'm talking and then I'm facilitating other people talking, because I do believe that the more people talk and the more people are engaged, the less likely, of course, they are to space out. So what focus means for a facilitator is being clear about the roadmap. And I'll give you an analogy. It would be like if you were interviewing somebody for a job. If you're a good interviewer, you're not going to do most of the talking. The interviewee is going to do most of the talking. but you have a roadmap for where you want to lead that person. And your roadmap is the series of questions that you ask. And those questions need to be smart questions, and they need to be sequenced in a smart way. And so I think focus for a facilitator really means the same thing. How are you going to lead the discussion a lot through the questions you ask? And how have you sequenced those questions? And have you focused the questions on the right thing? Because the art of asking questions is itself, I think, something that people can do well or not well. And in fact, I have a whole section in the book, the You've Got 8 Seconds book, just about the art of asking questions. And it belongs in the second strategy. It actually, in the book, I put it in the second strategy, variety. And it's in variety because it's more interesting in a conversation to have different voices than to have just you speaking and your monologue. So if I can get somebody else speaking, that adds variety. So one of the things I'm always telling people is that one of the most interesting things you can do when you're speaking, stop speaking. And stop speaking doesn't just mean, it does of course mean that there's rhetorical value to pausing, but it also means that there's tremendous value in getting other people in the conversation. And therefore being able to ask smart questions and really think through those questions often in advance in the way that you have is a skill.
I love that you're telling people to stop talking. Do you think that when you're asked to present something and be at the front of the room that you immediately think that you do have to do all the talking? Do you think that's still a perception of a lot of trainers these days?
Well, I want to be careful about generalizing across a category of people. But certainly I think it's a lot that trap that you're flagging is an important one because it is alive and well, and we all fall into it. And there is that sense, that when you're up in front of the room, that you should be the expert. But again, that's a trap. You don't have to be the expert. You just have to be an expert facilitator. You know, when I was starting in my career, I got this great advice about leading workshops. And what the person told me was, you really want to think about yourself as wearing two different hats. So there's one hat when you're presenting, that's one mode. And there's a certain body language, and there's a certain set of behaviors that accompany that mode. And then there's a second hat, which is you facilitating. And that's a different mode, and there's a different body language, and there's a different set of behaviors that ought to accompany that.
An excellent quote that we can share. So thank you for sharing that with us. I can see why that made such why it had such an impact on you, because I've never heard that quote, but I think it's really true now that I'm reflecting very quickly on the things that I've run. When you need to show someone a new model, you are in that not teacher, well, kind of a teacher state. And then when you move into role playing and getting groups to try it out, it does feel a bit more relaxed, and the questions start flowing a bit more as well.
Well, and it also, and again, I've got something in the book on this, again, under variety, because it goes even beyond facilitation to management. And what I mean by that is those two modes that we're flagging, you're presenting or you're facilitating. If you're a manager, that shows up in terms of, one way that shows up is every time you make a decision. And if you're presenting, what that means, and this is the language I use from the book, if you're presenting a decision, you're in the announcement mode. And if you are facilitating a decision, you are in the discuss mode. And it's really striking and dangerous how many managers mix those two modes up. And what that looks like is you might have a manager who wants to appear to be participative, meaning facilitative, and she might call everybody into the room and say, we've got this problem, I'm so glad you're here, would love to get all of your input. And then a robust discussion follows, at the end of which she says, well, that was just great, and let me tell you now what we're going to do. And you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, if you already knew what we were going to do, why did we go through this whole, what now seems like a charade of a discussion? So it's fine to announce a decision, and it's fine to discuss a decision, But just like for a facilitator, knowing which mode you're in is the critical thing, and also being able to have the flexibility to move across the modes so that you can do both. You're not a one-trick pony. If you're a facilitator, you can present and you can facilitate. If you're a manager, you can announce and you can discuss, but you're very clear, and more importantly, your audience is very clear what the mode is.
So you talk about flexibility being a really important skill, which links into that second topic of variety. Already in our conversation, I've noticed that you've brought in a couple of different analogies. Is that another way that you can slightly make things slightly different in the way that you deliver a message by bringing in stories and other things?
Oh, absolutely. Because stories and analogies, what stories and analogies do is that they add color. And what that means is that I'm always working with business executives and business leaders and business professionals. And the language of business, and this just is what is, the language of business is facts, figures, numbers, data, and one more thing, which is business abstractions. And so what I mean by that is an abstraction is anything that you really can't visualize. So an example from the book and from one of my workshops, I was working with a woman one day, and she had a presentation, and her topic was the quality maturity model. That was the topic. There's nothing wrong with that topic, especially if it resonates with her audience. But it's a very good example of what business abstractions. Because if you look at each of those three words, quality, maturity, model, not any of them, none of them are you able to visualize?
No.
And so if I say, on the other hand, imagine being at the beach, notice how easy that is immediately. Even if you don't like the beach, immediately what comes to mind is a beach. You either see a picture, or you hear the waves, or you can feel the sun. These are all concrete sensory experiences. And so if the language of business is facts and figures, numbers, data, but also business abstractions, then one way to be slightly different, as appropriate, is to color whatever your message is with an analogy or with a story, because that takes your audience immediately into something that they can visualize, which means that they're much more engaged and much more attentive.
Yeah, this has been a common theme with previous guests that I've interviewed on the show. So we had a guy, he was a project manager, now he's a humour engineer. More recently, Matthew Dix, who's written another book about storytelling as well. And what they say is they start collecting some examples of stories just through their day-to-day life. So then when they do need to lean on an example in a workshop, they've got a big repository of information they can refer to, which is really useful. Very useful, and it's a great habit. And I think the trick with all that is to realize that I do a whole workshop just on stories, and what I'm always trying to get people to realize is that every day your life and my life are filled with stories and anecdotes and examples, and they don't have to be anything. They're usually not anything large or big or melodramatic. They're these small human moments, and what makes the common thread, surprisingly, is that they tend to be negative emotional experiences. So they tend to be these small human moments where you were feeling frustrated or disappointed or surprised or anxious. And then the story becomes, how was that negative emotional experience resolved? Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's good. I'm just thinking, if I have any colleagues or friends come to me with a negative story, I'll just tell them to write it down.
Yeah, just tell them to write it down, or to say it out loud. But then if we go back, so that's variety. But then if we go back to focus, the issue with the story, of course, is that number one, you need to make sure that it's going to capture people's attention, which is why believe it or not, negative emotional situations work best. So we are, as humans, usually more interested in hearing about things that have gone wrong than things that have gone right. So you need to find a story that's going to hook people's attention. But then you also, because we're talking about a business context, you also need to make sure your story lands on a business relevant point. And you need to tell the story as concisely as you possibly can. And that's how we get back to focus. Because the question with focus is always, what's the right amount of detail? And so with your story, that's the question of the story. What's the right amount of detail? So we need enough detail so that the story has a here and now scene that would hook us. But we don't want so much detail that we lose the thread of the story and that we lose the point of the story.
And I can think of examples of both people that have told me stories that have had little detail, so you can't really connect or understand or visualize what was going on, and then too much that you end up just tuning out and your eyes glaze over. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it'd be interesting to read in your book how you actually decide on that detail. And so we talked about focus and variety, and the third one, which is quite interesting, you talked about presence and how do we, break down that myth of what it is to create a great presence, and why some people we just naturally gravitate towards them and others we don't. I mean, what is it? How do we explore that?
Yeah, and I think it's really important. So I want to say two things about presence. One is I do think it's a useful idea. And again, I have a whole workshop just on presence. But also, it's got a mystique, and it creates the sense that this is another one of those things that you're either born with or not. And so I think it's really important to try to make presence more concrete and to say, here are some of the things that contribute to other people's perception that you have presence. And so let's just stay on that for a minute. And I want to argue that presence ultimately is nothing more than an inference. That is, somebody infers about you based on a number of data points. So they saw you do this, they heard you say that, and so on and so forth. So they had a number of concrete experiences with you. And from those concrete experiences, which could be very, very fast, they then infer Leanne either has presence or she doesn't have presence. So presence lives as an inference, but what's within our control are those moments, those data points, those things that we did or didn't do, said or we didn't say, that led other people to the conclusion, to the inference that we have this mystical thing called presence. So I'll give you an example. I've got 10 things in the book, but the one that's probably the easiest to remember, one of the 10 is nonverbals. So how do you present yourself nonverbally? Now, let's say I'm giving a presentation, or let's say I'm facilitating something. Well, how do I walk in the room? How do I stand straight? Am I slouched? Do I speak with volume, or is my voice harder to hear? Do I have appropriate eye contact? Let's say that we're supposed to start the meeting at 9 o'clock, but maybe half the room hasn't arrived yet. Do I say, what should we do? Half the room isn't here, and I know there was bad traffic. Do you think we should just wait? So all that's kind of vacillating, as opposed to, good morning, it's 9 o'clock, let's start. Thank you all for coming. I realize there may be some people straggling in, but we've got a lot to cover. Here we go. So that's an example of saying something with authority that would communicate presence, although presence, again, is just an inference. So I am acting, another way of saying that is I'm going to say the same thing a different way. I can act with confidence in these nonverbal ways. Stand straight, have good eye contact, speak with volume. I can act with confidence, but I don't need the feeling of confidence to do any of that. And if I act with confidence enough times, that would be one thing that might lead people to the perception that I have this mystical thing called presence.
Yeah. That reminds me, just this week, I was asked to present something to our global executive team, and I speak all the time in front of people, but I was pretty nervous about this audience, and went in there, delivered it, prepared for it, walked out and wasn't too sure how it went, but I spoke to one of our executive assistants afterwards, and she said, "Oh my gosh, your presence, you were just so welcoming and it was fantastic," and all this sort of stuff. And I was trying to think, what was it about that?
Yeah, and when you said you were perceived as being welcoming, what that made me think about is smiling. And like almost all nonverbal behavior, smiling is a really good example of something that you and I want to do in moderation. Meaning, if we go back to flexibility, you want to be able to smile and you want to be able to not smile. So they're both really important, right? So if I'm up in front of, let's say, the kind of audience that you were confronting, I want to show a certain amount of seriousness. So I'm not going to be smiling the entire time I'm up in front of the room. But on the other hand, to smile at the beginning is very welcoming, and it makes it look like I'm happy to be there. And if I'm happy to be there, then I must have a certain level of being relaxed and confident. And so just in that smiling, you're sending all sorts of signals. And I think, as human beings, we have a long history of reading other people's body language. So we're very attuned. We're not always accurate about it, but we're very attuned. And so I've worked with executives who never smile, and they just scare everybody, particularly the people that report to them. And then I've worked with other people that are smiling 24/7, and they get the feedback, you don't seem to really have the seriousness that we're looking for. So it's again, this flexibility, the ability to do both. And that, I think we could take almost any nonverbal behavior. And again, nonverbals are just one of 10 ways that you can create the perception of presence. But if we're focused on nonverbals, you can take almost anything: smiling, eye contact, moving versus stillness. And we're looking for that middle ground.
Yeah, and the ability to flex when required.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we spoke about focus, variety, and presence. And I've got to say, in this conversation, you've just demonstrated all three things through the way that you personally communicate. How did you become so good at the art of communicating in general?
Well, I will take the compliment, although I'm sure we could find people that would argue, really? You think he's good? So we could get that. So I think, let's just say it's debatable how good or not good, but I'm certainly better, and I'm also committed to continuously improving. And I think that's the secret. So it's about, I do think it really, this won't shock anybody, but it really is about practice and feedback and practice and feedback and practice and feedback. And I've had, again, years and years of that. And I continue to do that. So I will make sure that on a regular basis, if somebody hasn't videotaped me for something, I'll videotape myself and I'll watch it. And I almost always have the exact same experience every time I videotape myself and watch it. I have the exact same experience over and over and over again, which is one, I'm grateful that I have gotten rid of a bad habit that somebody flagged. And number two, I'm dismayed that there's a new bad habit that I was completely unaware of up until I saw the video. So I think these good habits, trying to build on good habits, trying to eliminate bad habits, you never, ever, ever get to a point where you're done. There's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. And so I think it's the staying interested and committed to how can I do this thing to my very best ability all the time. And of course, you can't ever do it perfectly. But when I'm working with speakers, one of the things that I tell speakers, because this is a hard one, is every time you speak, immediately after, before you seek feedback, you want to give yourself feedback. And where you want to go is you first want to try to figure out, and this is the one that's hard, you want to try to figure out what 1, 2, 3 things did I do well? Even if you didn't think the whole thing was up to par, what 1, 2, or 3 things did you do well? And then on the other side, what 1, 2, or 3 things could I do better? And if you do that honestly and regularly, then you're done. That's fine. And you will continuously improve. And then, of course, it is very useful to not limit yourself to your own perception, but to seek feedback in all sorts of ways from other people, friends, family, colleagues.
That's actually a really good habit that you could just use in your day-to-day work life as well, or just life in general. Reflect on the day and say what 1, 2, or 3 things went well today overall in my day, and what are a few things I could improve upon. Good little skill to bring in. In terms of advice for facilitators that are starting their journey, I really wanted to talk about the point you raised before about video, and you're the first facilitator I've interviewed that has recommended that as an option for getting feedback. Most of the time it's talking to your colleague or whoever's in the room about that. Why is video, I mean, I think we all know why video is good. We can see ourselves. Is that the reason that we can it's very obvious when we see ourselves on a screen that, oh gosh, I'm putting my hands in my pockets or I'm looking this way a lot. Is that why it's so effective?
Yeah, and because a lot of what we're doing non-verbally, we're unaware of. So in poker, they would call that a tell meaning that you're doing something unconsciously that is signaling other people what kind of a poker hand you have. And we're very aware most of the time of other people's nonverbal behaviors. We're not so aware of our own behaviors. So we know what our intention is when we're communicating. What we don't know is actually how we're coming across. So, for example, one thing that I do, and I've been doing this for years, and I do it regularly, every single week, I never miss. It takes 2 minutes. And it's very simple. At the end of any week, Friday, I tend to work fairly late on Friday. I re-record my outgoing office message. It's a fairly easy thing to do. So if you called me, you would get, hi, this is Paul Hellman at Express Potential, whatever the week happened to be, the week of April, whatever. And the reason I do it is primarily practice. So it takes. I have a message, of course, because I'm all about focus. So my message is probably 15, 20 seconds at most. So it's a short message. But the point is that after I record it, I get to hear it before I save it. And that's the really interesting moment. So I get to play it back and hear it. And what might surprise you is that I would say at least half the time I go, that's not exactly how I want to come across. And then I re-record it. And sometimes I'll re-record it once or twice or 3 times. But the point is, for me, that is weekly vocal practice. So you asked about video, but voice is also really important. And a lot of us don't know how we're coming across. And people, it's that experience that you had maybe when you were really little. And the first time you hear your voice on a recording machine, and you're absolutely horrified because it doesn't sound like the voice that you know. You and I want to make friends with that voice and with that image so that we are recognizable to ourselves, but also that we're getting feedback on a regular basis.
Oh, wow. You're really challenging me here. I hate recording those messages, but that is such a great way to, like you said, to practice every week. Not only is it a great service for your colleagues and people calling you, but it's great practice. And I'm relating to this really well because I've discovered this by starting this podcast. On the first couple of episodes, I found it really hard to listen to myself and record and do all those things. But now it's becoming a lot easier. And I think every time I listen to an episode, I pick up on things that I need to improve for the next one. And I've got little notes written around the room as well to send me reminders.
Well, I love what you're saying because I think the takeaway for people listening is hard at first and then gets easier. And not only does it get easier, but also I'm sure your performance keeps getting better and better and better based on those things that you're posting, those reminders.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we spoke about, you just mentioned that voice, it's something that you need to get sort of used to. And I've read one of your articles on your website about speaking and how you say that speaking in itself is a very physical event. And prior to this call, we were talking about how when we travel, we get up pretty early and go for a jog and sort of things like that. Are there any other pre-presentation rituals that you have?
Well, I do find that having a ritual is really, really, really important. And I want to just come back to that. So whether you're speaking or you're facilitating, if you're up in front of an audience, that is a physical event. And in the same way, if you were to go running, you would probably do some kind of a warm-up. I think it's just so critical to do some kind of a warm-up. Now, the warm-up, my own preference, is to do a physical warm-up. And in that article that you're mentioning on my website, I think there's the line that I'm always telling people, the more you sweat before an event, the less you'll sweat during the event. So I find that if I do a 45-minute intense aerobic workout before a workshop or before a keynote speech, and I can't tell you the last time I did a workshop or did a keynote speech without doing that. So I will get up at crazy early hours in the morning just to exercise. But I'm not suggesting that that's the only way to warm up. I do mostly want to say that you need to find some way to warm up your voice, to warm up your body, and also to get into the right mood. Because I'm not assuming that you and I wake up every single day in the right mood to bring our best self to work. And so I would really stretch this and get people thinking about every day at work, even if you're working at home, to the extent to which you're interacting with other people on the phone or even an email, there is a performance element, and warm-up is really important. And being in the right mood is not something that happens by accident. So, for some people, this doesn't have to be complicated. For some people, it might be listening to a certain piece of music. What is the piece of music that gets your heart beating a little bit and that gets you feeling more upbeat? Well, listen to that. And, there's even a way to do this so that if you have a favorite piece of music, you listen to it enough times in real time so that then you could walk into a room and that music could be playing in your mind.
Yeah, nice one. I've recently, on Spotify, I started a First Time Facilitator playlist, and it's just the music that I listen to before workshops, and I thought it'd be nice if listeners could collaborate that and add theirs as well. So it's all upbeat.
Yeah, I think that's excellent.
Yeah, songs that you can really sing to and warm up your voice, which is fun. So who are your speaker role models? And who did you look up to when you were starting your journey in this, or do you still look up to them?
There's no one person that I could name that would, I think, be recognizable to the audience here. But I want to say the question that you're asking is a really important question. And I can think in my mind of any number of colleagues that I've worked with that I've learned from. And in fact, what I usually counsel people to do is learn from everybody. And I don't mean that in a kind of facile way. What I mean by that is every time you're in a room listening to somebody, a presenter, a facilitator, that's an opportunity. So that we can keep this very simple. It's very simple, which is just notice. The way I put it is just notice when are you tuned in and when are you tuned out, and blame it all on the person in the front of the room. So anytime that you're tuned in, that's a moment for you to be asking, wow, what is that person up front doing that caught my attention? And then, of course, the opposite for when you find your mind distracted.
I think we can all find examples of both. So that's excellent.
Yeah.
So finally, Paul, where can people find you?
Oh, well, I really appreciate your asking that, Leanne. So you can find me, the easiest way to find me is to visit my website. And I would love for people to do that because it's a totally, as of last week, a completely newly revamped website that I'm very, very excited about. And there are all sorts of free things there. There are fast video tips that are 2 minutes. There are fast print tips that are 30 seconds. And so if you go to the website, which is expresspotential.com, that would be the easiest way, and that's expresspotential.com, expresspotential.com. And if you like fast tips, and we're talking about 30-second tips, I've been doing these for about 10 years. CNBC.com, for about a 5-year period, they were posting these regularly, so they ran over 100 of them on their website. But I continue to write these, and that might be something that your listeners might be interested in trying. And the promise of that is it takes no time to read them, there's no spam, and no cost. So you can also reach me, people can also reach me by email, and the email is paul@expresspotential.com.
Fantastic. And congratulations on your new website as well. We might have to get you back in a future episode to see how you manage all your time and fit all this in. I know creating website and content, it's very time consuming.
It's time consuming, but I think if you're in the space that you're in and that I'm in and that your listeners are in, it's time well spent. And the reason is that it gives you something to say. It gives you new intellectual property. It makes you an object of interest. And it also is a way to discover your voice and what it is that you really want to say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being on the show. I guess the reason why I started this podcast is because I'm continuing my journey as a facilitator, and I really wanted to find out from superstars who were good at it and what they were doing, and just to share that with other people. And I've personally, just from our conversation, our 40-minute conversation, have learnt so much that I can do and implement straight away. There was a speech I did last year that has been recorded that I have not watched yet because I was scared of watching it. I will watch that today.
Oh, very good.
Yes, so that's really good.
I want to say that just based on this last 40 minutes, you really have excellent facilitation skills, and it's really been a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you, Leanne.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's wonderful connecting with people from around the world. And we will link to all the resources in your website and your email address on our show notes too, so our listeners can get in touch. And maybe, one day, look, after, say, the 50th or 60th episode, we'll have to get you back because I think there's so much more we could have explored here.
I'll look forward to that day.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thanks so much for tuning in to First Time Facilitator. If you liked the episode, please share it with your mates or subscribe to the podcast feed in iTunes. Till next time.